Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to be talking about Rebecca West, her life and times, and more specifically, her first novel, The Return of the Soldier. Born Cicely Isabel Fairfield on December 21st, 1892, in London, her parents were Charles and Isabella Fairfield. Her father was a journalist, and her mother, an accomplished pianist. West had two sisters, Letitia, or Letty as West affectionately called her, and Winifred. West maintained close relationships with her two sisters, but their bonds were tempestuous. The eldest, Letty, seemed especially to threaten West with her achievements as a student and then as a successful physician. Their relationship survived endless arguments and rivalries. Just as setting affects literary characters, who they become, how they act, their personality, West is truly a product of her environment. Much of who West becomes was due to the relationship with her father, not purposefully, but because of his actions. Her father was a journalist of decent reputation, but he had poor skills when it came to managing and investing his money. Her father seemed to have a direct impact on who West became because of their complex and influential relationship. This influence included early exposure to literature and intellectual pursuits, which most likely contributed to Rebecca's later achievements as a writer, journalist, and literary critic. Though this relationship was not without its challenges, Charles Fairfield was known for his unconventional views and involvement in socialist and progressive movements, which most likely influenced Rebecca's own political and social perspectives. As said, he had poor skills when it came to managing and investing his money. Those financial struggles that Rebecca witnessed surely influenced her strong sense of independence and the need to support herself through writing. Eventually, Charles deserted the family for an opportunity to launch a pharmaceuticals factory in Sierra Leone. He never returned to his family and died alone in Liverpool. West was only a teenager when her father died. Her father's actions left West feeling ambivalent towards men, contradictions that would later emerge in life as a feminist, mistress, and supportive wife. After her father left for Sierra Leone, his distraught wife relocated her daughters to Edinburgh, where Rebecca attended a girls' preparatory school. Despite her intellectual promise, however, she did not proceed to university. Instead, at age 18, she moved to London, where she took a stab at acting. This proved unsuccessful. She dropped out of the Academy of Dramatic Arts after 1 year. What she did take from that experience was her name, Rebecca West. She took this from one of the strong heroines in the play, Ramsmerholm, by Henrik Ibsen. As mentioned, around her father, political discussions were ever present, and this affected and politicized West from an early age. West and Letty began to attend suffrage marches, and at the same time, West was writing for the feminist publications Free Women and the social newspaper, The Clarion. West also wrote for many leading US and British publications. Listed on this slide are a few of those: New York Herald Tribune, New Statesman, New York American, Daily Telegraph. Although she aligned with the left, she had always viewed Bolshevism as problematic and would not support it. This often put her at odds with other left-wing intellectuals of the period. She was not one to follow an ideology simply because others did. She had insight to make up her own mind. West had two prominent relationships throughout her life. In 1911, West wrote a scathing review of H.G. Wells' novel Marriage and wrote a personal attack where she said, "He is the old maid among novelists." Though offended, Wells must have realized her writing was of high caliber because he invited her to lunch, and that lunch started a relationship with Wells, which eventually became intimate. Unfortunately, West found herself pregnant by Wells, who was a married man. West's relationship with Wells went on for 10 years, through which he continually asked him to leave his wife and marry her. But nothing ever came of those ultimatums. In 1923, she broke off the relationship for good. In 1930, She married banker Henry Maxwell Andrews. West and Andrews spent much time traveling. Some of those travels were the basis for her novels Black Lamb and Grey Falcon. West died in 1983 and for 70 years of her life wrote novels, feminist rhetoric, social commentary. To list them all would take pages. Well, let's turn our attention to one of those writings for the remainder of this lecture. Her first novel, The Return of the Soldier, which focuses on mental health impacts on those who fought. This wartime mental health impact was known as shell shock. Shell shock was coined by the soldiers themselves, but today we call it PTSD, although PTSD doesn't have the physical symptoms that shell shock did. Before we dive too far into the novel itself, we should discuss shell shock to fully understand its impact and in turn the impact it has on the novel. Symptoms of shell shock included fatigue, tremors, confusion, nightmares, and impaired sight and hearing. It was often diagnosed when a soldier was unable to function and no obvious cause could be identified. In an effort to better understand and treat the condition, the Army appointed Charles S. Myers, a medically trained psychologist, to consult and offer opinions on cases of shell shock and gather data. He concluded that these were psychological rather than physical casualties and believed that the symptoms were overt manifestations of repressed trauma. Myers argued that shell shock could be cured through cognitive and effective reintegration. While Myers believed that he could treat individual patients, the greater problem was how to manage the mass psychiatric casualties that followed major offensives. Drawing on ideas developed by French military neuropsychologists, Myers identified 3 essentials in the treatment of shell shock. 1, he said, promptness of action. 2, suitable environment. And 3, psychotherapeutic measures, though those measures were often limited to encouragement and reassurance. Inevitably, Myers was criticized by those who believed that shell shock was simply cowardice or malingering. Some thought the condition would be better addressed by military discipline. Though he did persuade the War Office to set up training courses in military psychiatry and the treatment of shell shock. Next, I would like to show you a clip from the Great War series on YouTube. I'm only going to play a few minutes of this video, which has some real good insight into shell shock. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll loop back and discuss.
You weren't hit by any bullet or shrapnel. You survived multiple battles, even charges into no man's land and trench raids, and yet you're still a real casualty of war and suffer a variety of terrible physical and mental problems, for you have shell shock. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode on shell shock. In the First World War, it was as early as the first battles, such as the Mons, that military and medical authorities faced what would become a familiar feature of the war. Men with no physical injury showing real medical problems, many of which would persist long after the war. Headaches, cardiac irregularities, blindness, amnesia, depression, anxiety, loss of appetite, nightmares, and many more. By 1915, the symptoms had a name in English: shell shock. But while the name was new, it had been around for a long time, and becoming unhinged during war is as old as war itself. It's mentioned in Gilgamesh and the writings of Herodotus, and it goes under a variety of names throughout history. In the Napoleonic Wars, it was a bullet wind, when soldiers would have reactions to nearly being shot. In the American Civil War, soldier's heart was the name given to persistent cardiac problems. In more recent times, it would be called battle fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, or today, PTSD to a certain extent, although that refers only to psychiatric symptoms and not the unexplained physical symptoms. What was new in World War I was the scale of it. As many as 80,000 British soldiers suffered, for example, and 100,000 Germans were treated for hysteria in field hospitals. Shell shock and its treatment would help shape the relatively new fields of neurology and psychology and would challenge traditional ideas about madness and normality. War syndrome and its possible treatments were first studied systematically in the Russian wars with Turkey in 1887 and Japan in 1904 and 1905. In the second one, Russian doctors prescribed forward treatment, which meant close to the front lines. The idea being to intervene before the condition became fixed and the men could no longer fight. Doctors compared symptoms they saw to those of survivors of man-made disasters, such as train wrecks, and the symptoms were often the same. There was even a name for them, railway spine. And in the 1860s and 70s, there was a series of court cases in Britain and Germany about compensating victims of railway spine. And the issues of cause and compensation would define the World War I debate about shell shock. Now, everyone agreed that the symptoms were real. But what were they caused by? Was it actual damage like micro lesions on the brain? Or was it purely emotional or psychological? And were sufferers predisposed to it? Did they have a weak character or latent epilepsy? Well, whether physical or mental, it was generally agreed that the external cause was the force of modern artillery. Belgian doctor Octave Laurent believed that speeding projectiles caused variations in pressure that affected the inner ear, and initially, the physical cause idea prevailed in general. Part of this was pure practicality. There was a great reluctance to accept the psychological route, since this would lead to an explosion in compensation claims. But slowly but surely, psychological explanations were accepted as well as physical, or instead. But how do you treat something so nebulous? Well, you tried a variety of things. There was disciplinary treatment, such as Faradism, named after Michael Faraday, which was electric shock treatment. There was analytical treatment, the idea that the patient was suffering from internal conflict, and a close relationship with a therapist could help. There were talking cures based on re-experiencing repressed memories. But along with any kind of treatment, there were ethical questions and doubts. Shell shock was pretty easy to fake, and easy enough to get off duty once you faked it. But how do you tell fakers? And what do you do once someone is cured anyhow? Do you send him back to the front lines where the whole thing could just get reignited? It was a big problem, and it was a big international problem. And the medical world was international. Germany was the leader in medicine, for example, while the pioneer figure in neurology was the Frenchman Jean-Martin Charcot. But though the questions and issues were the same all over, there were differences in treatment and interpretation. In Germany, it was Kriegshysterie and the Kriegszitterer were the trembling veterans who begged on street corners. Now, here's something to keep in mind, right? Back in 1884, Bismarck had passed accident insurance legislation, which compensated for medical and nervous effects of industrial accidents. Got it? Okay. Well, what this led to 30 years later was the rejection of psychological causes of shell shock in Germany for clearly stated economic reasons. It would cost the state too much money to compensate people if it was psychological. In fact, some German psychologists saw it as their job to protect the state from a proliferation of mental invalids and war pension recipients. So Germany set up a system based on containment, preventing men who might be susceptible from returning to the front and giving them work as their psychiatric treatment. These men were treated just like industrial workers. The factories and the shop floors were seen as therapeutic environments and were near treatment centers. Entire villages for the nervously ill were constructed so that, under the direction of nerve doctors, men could take all sorts of jobs. And they were real paid jobs that had value, not just make work. There was no room for sympathy or pity. That was effeminate and pathogenic. There were, of course, more active and bizarre treatments. Faradism, barking military orders at patients, the sudden singing of the national anthem to shock men into regaining their hearing. It was different for the French. The French believed in treatment at the front and intentionally obstructed the easy evacuation of such casualties. Many French doctors believed that shell shock was caused by suggestion, though they recognized that it was unconscious, but they used often brutal methods to bring it out so they could then create the will to overcome it. There was a famous legal case in May 1916 when a French soldier was arrested for assault when he hit his doctor who was trying to apply an electric shock. Apparently, the shock he had already been given was strong enough to move a streetcar, and he would rather be court-martialed than repeat the experience. This led to the issue of whether injured soldiers had the rights of private citizens or were under military command and thus could be forced to be treated. Italians believed that going home triggered it, that the stress of seeing how women and children struggled with the men away at war sent them over the edge, and psychiatric intervention was geared towards unmasking malingerers. In Russia, they were quite forward-thinking, and in 1916, doctors called for special hospitals and treatment centers, and then the revolution ended all that. In Britain, the psychological explanation was more readily accepted. Interestingly enough, officers were affected percentage-wise more often than enlisted men in the British Army, and some of the numbers are staggering. During the Battle of the Somme, in some areas, as high as 40% of the casualties were nervous disorders, and it apparently was contagious in some units. The Army was worried, though, that seeing it as psychological made weakness acceptable, though treatment changed when it began to be seen as a medical problem and not a disciplinary one. And by mid-1918, there was a whole network of British hospitals dedicated to shell shock.
So, getting to see some footage of soldiers that have shell shock should bring our novel's character into perspective. It was also interesting to hear about the phenomenon being present even before World War I and how treatments varied from country to country. We're going to reflect back on some of the things that were said in that video as we continue. So, The Return of the Soldier, the novel that we're analyzing that Rebecca West wrote, the premise of the story is that a soldier returns to his family's estate having lost his memory of the war in the immediate pre-war years. In Captain Christopher Baldry's mind, he cannot remember his wife and believes he is still in love with an innkeeper's daughter, whom he had a relationship with a decade before. His wife believes that he is only pretending not to remember her. She eventually brings in a psychiatrist who diagnoses Captain Baldry as having shell shock. The Return of the Soldier was West's first novel and was written during World War I. West examines the relationships and friendships between Captain Baldry and three women: his cousin Jenny, who is the narrator of the novel, his wife Kitty, and his previous love from his youth, Margaret. The Return of the Soldier, while seen as a modernist text, mystical language and spiritualist imagery permeate the novel. The Return of the Soldier's spiritual and mystical language has been largely dismissed by critics as a Victorian holdover. But some examples of this mystical and spiritual language are seen when, on page 66, there's mention of two crystal balls. On page 70, there's mention of an englobed in peace as in a crystal sphere. And also on page 70, it's mentioned quiet magic circle. In the journal article, Like a Beautiful Voice Singing in a Darkened Room, Mysticism and Modernity in Rebecca West's The Return of the Soldier, the author Catherine Montgomery argues, this mystical language is more than an aesthetic choice. Understanding this mystical worldview is central to the understanding of the novel's conclusion. Jenny says that she and Margaret had to restore Chris's memory for the divine essential of his soul. If we left him in his magic circle, he would not be quite a man. This may not just be a Victorian holdover, but a way to understand the turn-of-the-century cultural movement that saw a holistic understanding of the universe through exploring the connection between the soul and the body. However, most critics prefer readings that seem to emphasize the novel's modernity. Montgomery further argues that the novel could be understood as a feminist text that reclaims the female homefront experience of World War I In its portrayal of amnesia and shell shock, the novel is also widely considered to be one of the first novels with primary interest in modern psychology, both modernist themes. I do think it's important to note that while some of the writing is spiritual and flowery, West is fully seen as a modernist writer. In Faye Himmel's article, Noel Coward, Rebecca West in Modernist Scene, she reiterates, Rebecca West's major contribution to modernist literature has now been acknowledged by critics, and she is usually identified as a writer affiliated to, if not always fully aligned with, modernist aesthetics and preoccupations. Modernism is embodied by Kitty and Dr. Gilbert. Kitty represents the modern woman, practical, forward thinking. She's determined to bring Chris back to the present and restore his memory, even if it means confronting painful truths about their marriage. In a journal article called Reading Kitty's Trauma by Rebecca Pulsifer, she states, set in a claustrophobic and often lonely domestic atmosphere in which three women vie for Chris's attention, the novel is as much a study of women's adjacent involvement in the war as an account of male war trauma. Yet again, another way to analyze the novel. Dr. Gilbert, on the other hand, a psychiatrist, represents the rational, scientific approach to understanding the human mind. He views Chris's condition as a psychological phenomenon that can be treated through modern methods. Mysticism and feminism are both lenses that this novel can and should be viewed through. But let's examine a bit deeper. Next, I'd like to take another look at a quick video clip with an interesting observation that can be possibly viewed through the feminist lens. This is November book club meeting. It's a video series on YouTube, and I'm just going to play a short portion of this. I'm going to zoom it up to the end here.
Hi, everyone.
And right about right in here.
World. So it's very different, but I found it interesting to think of
Yes.
the juxtaposition.
And I will also add one more thing too, is that it's the women who are interesting in this.
Oh,
In
yes.
the end, I feel like, what's all this fuss about Chris? Really,
Yeah.
doesn't come over as having that much personality,
No,
does
he
he?
doesn't.
I mean, maybe again, through Jenny's eyes,
You don't see
you
him.
don't see him properly, but in a weird way, you also don't. You think, why does she love him so
Yes.
much?
Yes.
He comes across as quite a boring individual in some way.
He obviously came alive for Margaret and their
Yes.
time. And I must
Yeah.
say, it's a book that really, sadly, has almost no food in it. I did look through.
Yeah.
So, in the November book club video, the ladies make an interesting observation that this is more a book about the three women than it is about Chris. They state it's the women who are interesting, and Chris comes across as a boring individual. The novel, in a way, explores the societal roles of women during World War I. While the novel doesn't explicitly address feminism in the modern sense, it provides a lens through which to examine gender dynamics and women's agency within context of early 20th century England. One aspect of feminism evident in the novel is the portrayal of the female characters who challenge traditional gender roles and expectations. Kitty, Chris's wife, she does not necessarily conform to the passive obedient wife stereotype. Instead, she is assertive and takes action and tries to, cure Chris. She's the one who, after all, brings in Dr. Gilbert. The novel also touches upon the theme of female solidarity and support. Jenny, Chris's cousin, and Margaret form a bond as they navigate the complexities of Chris's selective memory. Their collaboration and mutual support highlight the importance of women's relationships and solidarity in challenging times. Additionally, a feminist lens shows the novel indirectly critiquing the patriarchal power structure. The expectation that men must be strong and unemotional, especially in the face of war, is countered by Chris's over emotional outbursts and portrayal of a broken soldier. Looking at the return of the soldier through a feminist lens, we can see the exploration of gender dynamics, women's agency, the impact of patriarchy breaking down. West does seem to make the female characters interesting and, in turn, the male characters boring. Let's flip back now to the book November Book Club again and take another look at another short clip. Here we go. Find it right about here. One.
Thought that it was so interesting because essentially it's another unreliable narrator book, isn't it? We've got three women, and they're all waiting the return of the soldier.
Yes.
It's one of their husbands, but the narrator is his cousin, who's the same age, I believe, as him.
Yeah, so about 35.
35, and she's really the narrator of the story. So we see everybody from her point of view. Yeah. And I found that fascinating. I really did.
It was a very limited point of view. Her perspective is very narrow, and yes, you're right, you really only see everything through her eyes, and she is an unreliable narrator, as you say. And even there's a point in the story where Chris, the soldier who's returned, tells her about how he first fell in love with Margaret, his first love.
Yes.
And it's Margaret who he remembers.
Yes, he has amnesia after sort of shell shock, doesn't he?
Yes.
Only remembers 15 years previously, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And he tells Jenny, his cousin, about how he first met Margaret, how he fell in love with her. But she says something like she wasn't sure if she remembered it all correctly, but she felt that she did. And so when she tells the story again, you're not completely sure if it is truthful or not.
No, it's quite accurate.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel so sorry for Jenny. I mean, what an awful example of unrequited love.
It really is. She's obviously obsessed and deeply in love with him, and has never fully admitted it.
No, and she never even, I don't think, fully comes out with saying that she's in love with him in the book.
No.
But of course it's so clear that she is. We are having a book.
So, looking at the November Book Club video, again, another short clip, and the ladies point out something interesting, that the unreliable narrator aspect. Jenny can be seen as an unreliable narrator. While she's telling the story from her point of view, and when she discusses her perspectives and her own feelings, that is reliable, but she is telling the rest of the story from her interpretation of others, what she's observing. Another issue is that Jenny may feel she may have unrequited love for Chris, so her whole point of view is skewed and biased because of her own feelings for Chris. While mysticism and feminism both are lenses that this novel can be viewed through. Next, let's focus on some of the more modern aspects in the psychological phenomenons. And we're going to take one more look at a short video clip from the November Book Club.
Hi everyone.
So 8:51, right here, short clip, and then we'll circle back.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I read the introduction in this, which I really recommend, and it's by Victoria Glendinning.
Yeah.
And she wrote that this loss of memory that can be a quite amateur device to use in plotting books.
Yes.
However, in this, it isn't used at all in that way. And in fact, it was very common for shell-shocked soldiers to lose their memory.
Yes.
And Rebecca West would have known that. And
yes.
she was writing this still during the First World War.
I assume right at the beginning of 1918.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not so unlikely as it may strike a more modern audience now for someone to be so traumatized.
And it's interesting how they bring in a psychoanalyst.
Yes, which in those days, they didn't understand much about the inner workings of the
human
mind
psyche.
And yes, exactly. And that was interesting. And in fact, how they recover Chris's memory is through linking his mind back to an earlier tragedy, the loss of his child.
Yes, and it's Margaret who knows that's how his first love, that's how to win back his memory.
Yes.
He can't deny the loss of his son.
No, exactly. Which was also very sad. And it kind of it made the novel come full cycle.
I felt that.
It starts also with the two women, Kitty, his wife, and Jenny, his cousin, in the nursery. And you know that a child has died.
Yes.
From the beginning. And then that's what's brought.
So the ladies point out something interesting here about the memory loss device. And we're going to take a look at that now and analyze that. But they also pointed out with that memory loss device that they brought in a psychologist to review and try to help Chris. And as they said back in those days, it wasn't an exact science yet, right? So, and we do see that in the book, and we'll talk about that a little bit coming up here. So there are many interpretations and analyses of this story, The Return of the Soldier. But since the main plot revolves around shell shock, I want to focus on a couple of different interpretations of the characters and in turn the concept of shell shock. So let's start at the end of the book. I'm going to read the ending. I have a clip of that on the screen. You could see the part that I will be reading. So on page 90 of our novel. Jenny, aren't they there? They're both there. Is he coming back? He's coming back. Jenny, how does he look? Oh, how could I say it? Every inch a soldier. She crept behind me to the window, peered over my shoulder, and saw. I heard her suck her breath with satisfaction. He's cured, she whispered slowly. He's cured. This controversial conclusion, many readers and scholars are dismayed with the ending. One such journalist article, Trauma and Cure in Rebecca West's Return of the Soldier, states, the ending fails to test of both narrative and psychoanalytic plausibility. It is too tidy, too pat, too gimmicky, yet also unsatisfying in its indeterminacy. Writing in 1928, West herself expressed doubts whether any psychoanalyst would believe in the cure so sharply affected. There seems to be, a magic to Chris's recovery. This is not criticizing West's writing or story concept. She clearly did her research. Remembering back to our review of Shell Shock, Charles S. Myers concluded that the symptoms were overt manifestations of repressed trauma. Now, crucial to these observations is that Chris's brand of forgetting is characterized not by absence of memory, but by presence of an obsession or manifestation, as Jenny puts it in the novel on page 67. 67, she says, it was unconscious of his resolution not to know. This obsession or manifestation circles back to Plinkerton's interpretation of Margaret. Margaret tries to prove that the ending can be plausible. Plankerton writes, reviewing the dismissive accounts, one begins to sympathize with the characters responsible for the sudden recovery of Chris's memory. First, poor Margaret, who gets little credit for knowing, with a precision no less profound for its utter intuitiveness, how best to shock Chris out of his forgetting. Well, whether this is really what Chris needs or desires, that's another question altogether. But if the novel teaches us anything about Margaret, it's not to underestimate her. We are told throughout the novel of many traumas that Chris has experienced. Right from the first page, we are introduced to the sadness of the traumatic death of his baby son, Oliver. But also, his breakup with Margaret, we have to ask, did this cause trauma even before Oliver? Kitty and Chris have both covered over the fact of their son's death, even though they're keeping the bedroom just as if the child still lives there. And Kitty and Jenny never mentioned the subject to Chris either. Kitty even withholds this information from Dr. Anderson as if it was insignificant that Chris has ever had a son. Plankerton now turns his focus on Margaret. He states, Margaret takes naturally and brilliantly to the job of psychotherapist, as very few literary critics seem to have appreciated, but continues to argue that Dr. Anderson is simply a device in service of the narrative's moral choice. Margaret does prompt the doctor, not the other way around. On page 81, Margaret says, I know how you could bring him back, she volunteered. Anderson's reaction to her suggestion combines humility with intellectual respect. He's smart enough to know that this woman has a thing to teach him. So, looking back to that November book club video, the last clip we watched where the lady said that this psychotherapy study or expert is not really, it's not a clear science at this point. So Margaret might know just as much as he does. Let's look at page 81 into page 82. I'm going to read a quote. Part of it is up on the screen here. This describes the doctor's and Margaret's interaction discussing how to handle Chris's situation. The little man had lost in a moment his glib assurance, his knowingness about the pathway of the soul. Well, I'm willing to learn. Remind him of the boy, said Margaret. The doctor ceased suddenly to balance on the balls of his feet. What boy? They had a boy. He looked at Kitty. You told me nothing of this. I didn't think it mattered, she answered, and shivered and looked cold as she always did at the memory of her unique contact with death. He died 5 years ago. He dropped his head back, stared at the cornice, and said, with the soft malignity of a clever person dealing with the slow-witted, these subtle discontents are often the most difficult to deal with. Sharply he turned to Margaret. How would you remind him? Take him something the boy wore, some toy they used to play with. Their eyes met wisely. It would have to be you that did it. Her face assented. Plankerton points out that one might argue that the doctor prompts Margaret to this last realization, at least that she must be the one to confront Chris. However, the assent she silently communicates suggests that quite strongly that, as always, Margaret is a step or two ahead. Lastly, looping back to something I mentioned earlier, that Margaret knows how to best shock Chris out of his forgetting. The most telling line in the novel reinforces that Margaret is the solution. Captain Baldry demands, if I do not see Margaret Allington, I shall die. Again, looking back at something the ladies in the November book club video said, they said, he came alive from Margaret. This reiterates how important Margaret's character is to the whole plot. Chris's determination throughout the novel to be with Margaret foreshadows that she's the only one who can help him and the only one he truly wants to be with. These are just a few ways to interpret and analyze the novel. There's a handful other ways. Some of the suggestions could be looking at class and social structure. Margaret and then Jenny and Kitty. You have that dynamic shift of class. Trauma and healing, love and sacrifice, responsibility and duty. You can also look at social expectations and norms, and war and trauma, or the class divide, or memory and identity as well. So, for final thoughts, we took an in-depth exploration of the life and literary work of Rebecca West, particularly focusing on her first novel, The Return of the Soldier. We began looking at West's background, highlighting her family, upbringing, and early experiences, which shaped her identity and worldview. West's complex relationship with her father, a journalist with unconventional views and financial struggles, was discussed as a significant influence on her intellectual pursuits and social perspectives. We further examined West's career in journalism and politics, emphasizing her involvement in feminist and socialist movements. Her relationships, particularly with H.G. Wells and her eventual marriage to banker Henry Maxwell Andrews, were explored in detail, highlighting the personal and professional challenges she faced. The discussion then shifted to West's literary achievements, focusing on The Return of the Soldier. In The Return of the Soldier, we explored shell shock, examined the historical context on the condition and its treatments during World War I. The video that we watched emphasized the aspect that shell shock has been around longer than World War I, and the different viewpoints that different countries had on the way they would treat shell shock. It also emphasized the psychological impact on soldiers. The novel was then analyzed through various lenses, including its mystical language, feminist themes, and modernist aesthetics. The controversial conclusion of the novel was examined, with critics questioning the plausibility of Captain Baldry's sudden recovery of memory and its implications on the narrative. We concluded with an analysis of the novel's controversial ending, highlighting Margaret's role in Chris's recovery and challenging dismissive interpretations of her character and emphasizing Margaret's intuitive understanding of Chris's trauma and her pivotal role in his healing process. This ultimately suggests that she, Margaret, is the key to his restoration. On the screen, I've posted my Works Cited page, and you'll see that all these articles you can access on the Murray State University Library website, and they're available in full for your further reading. I thank you for joining me, and I hope you all have an excellent week and rest of the term. Bye.